Thank you, Karim. So I see you got Mike Creighton's book here, the original copy too. I need to take this back home. So thank you all for coming this afternoon, gracing me with your presence, and a special thank you to my host, the university and the institute, and to Karim Dickie at the Caribbean Council for helping to arrange this forum at such short notice. And I want to thank the Foreign Affairs team that's traveling with me, Jerusha Ali, who's our Director General, sitting up front, the Foreign Affairs officers, Rolanda Davis, Jaden Swain, and our Second Secretary, Justin Smith, who's sitting up at the back, and then the aides, Bernard Ferguson and Jeffrey Charite. So that's the whole team there. I was telling one of your colleagues that I was speaking to over the last few days that we actually had 68 Bahamians in Samoa for the Commonwealth Heads of Government Conference. I'm sure that's probably the largest amount of Bahamians in this part of the world for quite a while. So this is the last of 2 days here in New Zealand. As you heard from my biography, this is the third time that I've been foreign minister. The Bahamas operates its foreign policy within a multilateral context. This was the foundational principle laid down by our founding Prime Minister, Lyndon Pindling, 15 years ago when we joined the United Nations. We, like New Zealand, are members of the Commonwealth. There are 56 of us in that body. And I determined when I first became minister in 1992 that we should have diplomatic relations with every Commonwealth country. And we are just now getting close to that fact. We consider New Zealand to be a friend in every respect, having cooperated in the Commonwealth context and also at the United Nations. I want you to know the Bahamas is seeking a seat at the United Nations Security Council in the year 2032 to 2033, and the election takes place in the fall of 2031. We are seeking actively the support of New Zealand and this region, and we offer in exchange support to New Zealand in its diplomatic and trade ambitions. The other important body in this context in which we operate our foreign policy is the CARICOM group. So this is a group of 15 countries. 13 of them are former colonies of the United Kingdom, and you add to that Haiti and Suriname. Haiti, of course, being a former French colony, and Suriname being a former Dutch colony. And we seek to coordinate the foreign policy of our countries to our mutual benefit. The number one issue for all of our countries, I would say, in this year is the issue of climate change. New Zealand has been a leader in the fight on climate change, and we look forward to working with New Zealand on the issues at the COP29, which will take place in Baku in Azerbaijan in November. Now, I've come here directly from Samoa. There, the Prime Minister of Samoa and the Prime Minister of the Bahamas, Philip Davis, signed a communique establishing diplomatic relations between the two countries. The Prime Minister of Samoa and her people presided over a successful heads of government meeting. The two main issues at the meeting were climate change and reparatory justice for slavery and indigenous people. Having regard to the history of your country, that was also a theme that I've discussed while here. I had an excellent meeting last evening with a representative of the Maori community and explained some of the synergies and convergences of our shared experiences in colonialism from history and how we can learn from each other on these issues. In the Caribbean, we are engaged in a fight for reparatory justice arising out of the millions of African slaves who were brought forcibly to the Caribbean during the centuries 1400 to 1800s. It is believed that 3 million slaves were brought to the Caribbean by the British and millions more to the Americas. And it is now widely acknowledged that there was a great moral wrong, the slave trade. Millions perished in the Middle Passage, The slave owners got compensation, the slaves and their dependents did not. And the bonds that supported the borrowing to pay off the British government's debt for the compensation, those bonds were just settled in the year 2015. So there's now an argument for reparatory justice. In the Bahamas, where the majority of the descendants of the country are descendants of African slaves, there is no native indigenous population or First Nation. By the time the Europeans and Africans arrive, history tells us that the Spanish, who first visited the islands in 1492 and afterwards, had denuded the islands of its populations and left them barren of its human population. So in 1648, then when the British settlers arrived, fleeing from religious persecution in Bermuda, what history says is there was no one in the islands. And so the society as it's presently constructed began in its present incarnation in 1648. The descendants of African slaves became the majority of the population after the War of Independence that created the United States. And loyalists to the British Crown were expelled from the United States and moved to the Bahamas to take advantage of the land being offered in generous grants for their loyalty to the Crown. They implemented a system of apartheid both in law and later by social practice from 1648 through 1782. There followed, therefore, a period of slavery and by social construct, which was not set aside until what we call Majority Rule Day on the 10th of January, 1967. So Majority Rule Day, 10th of January, 1967, marks the first time that an African-led government governed the Bahamas. Slavery was abolished in 1834. So today we have a modern democratic state, but we suffer the dysfunctions of the legacy of slavery and underdevelopment. We also face an existential threat of climate change, with 80% of the land in the Bahamas being within 1 meter of the sea. The highest point in the country is 206 feet. But we have faith that we can overcome all of these obstacles and difficulties through working together. And what better place to start than right here in New Zealand? I think of this visit as establishing a beachhead for the Bahamas. And we all hope that this will be the beginning of another chapter in what we call a beautiful friendship. We are actively seeking someone, for example, who can be an honorary consul to look after our interests in New Zealand. We see tremendous opportunities for collaboration with New Zealand and the Pacific Islands. We share similar challenges and can learn from each other's experiences. We can work together to advocate for climate change, strengthen democracy, and promote peace and security in our regions and reparatory justice. And I commend New Zealand's ongoing work in supporting the Pacific Island nations to address the current impacts of climate change and to build resilience against the challenging future it promises. As we face these global challenges, strong partnerships are essential. The Bahamas and New Zealand, though geographically distant, are close in our shared values and the commitment to the Commonwealth. Our diplomatic ties, formalized in this century, are a testament to this connection. And I want to thank the High Commissioner, who is here with us today, for her dedication in strengthening our regional bonds. We look forward to welcoming her to Nassau. New Zealand's engagement in the Caribbean, particularly on SIDS issues, is invaluable, and we share a commitment to a rules-based international order, multilateralism, and sustainable development. We recognize New Zealand's deep ties with the Caribbean, spanning culture, sports, and the Commonwealth. And we see opportunities to expand our collaboration in areas like climate resilience, trade, renewable energy, and disaster preparedness. The CARICOM Development Cooperation Arrangement is a key part of this. The challenges we face demand innovative solutions and joint action. So we invite New Zealanders to visit the Bahamas, experience our culture, and witness the beauty and fragility of our precious islands firsthand. We encourage research partnerships with the University of the Bahamas, the Small Island Sustainability Center, a hub for finding practical solutions for island nations. Our aspiration is a world where all nations, big and small, work together to solve common problems. And I urge you to join us. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Minister. So we have time for questions, and as I mentioned at the start, just as a courtesy to the speaker, if you're able to give your name and affiliation, that would be appreciated, and we've got some mics that we can hand around as well. So have we got a first question from the audience?
Thank you, Excellency, for your, sorry for my throat. I have a question which relates to situation in your region. You have two interesting neighbors, the United States and a little bit south or southwest Cuba. How would you describe at the moment the relation between your country and those two I mentioned?
The relationship with both is good. We don't have any disputes with Cuba and no disputes with the United States, even though they disagree on relations between themselves. We have said to them that the policy of the embargo is wrong. The strangulation of the Cuban economy is also wrong, and that this is causing a security problem for the region. So tomorrow there's going to be a vote at the United Nations, the 30th of October, which is an annual vote sponsored by the Cuban government to condemn the embargo against Cuba. It's almost ritualistic because it doesn't move the needle anywhere, but we will be voting to support that resolution as we have in the past. In the Bahamas, there are Cuban doctors, Cuban nurses, and there are also teachers in the schools. The United States disagrees with us having them there, and in their human rights reports have suggested that this is human trafficking because part of the proceeds of the salaries of these teachers, doctors, may go to the Cuban government. But again, that's an issue for the United States and Cuba, it's not for us. So that summarizes the position. Obviously, we spend about $1.1 billion a year in the South Florida economy to buy food. Most of the tourists who come to the Bahamas are Americans. We host about 9 million tourists a year, and you can fly to Miami every hour on the hour. It's 35 minutes or so by air. So it's very close. People go shopping there, go to school there, go to the hospital there. It's quite close. Yeah. As a matter of fact, sorry, you can clear customs and immigration, U.S. customs and immigration in the Bahamas. So when you land in the States, it's a domestic landing. Yeah.
Okay, have we got a next question? Ruben.
Minister, Ruben Azizian. I'm Ruben Azizian, chair of the Auckland branch. Minister, thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. In terms of trade relations, who are your major trade partners? And related to that, most countries in the world have China as their #1 trade partner. Are you an exception, or are you also in that same group?
So to answer the last question, we are an exception because our major trading partner is the United States. And I would think after that is Canada and then the EU. Even intra-CARICOM trade is probably 0.5% of our total volume of trade. So as I said, we spend about $1.2 billion on food alone, largely in the South Florida area. And that those are the inputs for the tourism product, the service product that we offer. And that's one of the reasons why the Bahamian dollar is 1-for-1 the US dollar. So it's freely exchanged across the counter. If you came there with US dollars, you just pay in US dollars, or you can pay in B dollars, but it's the same thing. In terms of China, China has substantial investments in the Bahamas. There is a hotel project called Bahamar, which was built as a result of a loan by the China Export-Import Bank by a Chinese construction company. Investment is about $3.2 billion. It's a huge facility. And there's also a port which is owned by the Hutchison Whampoa Company, which is a Hong Kong-based company in Grand Bahama. So their investments are substantial. And the other thing I would say is if you're looking for development capital, apart from the Middle East, China is the only place you can get it. The US does not offer development capital. And we're just in the process of building 2 new hospitals. We've had to raise the money for one of them from China. So it is a source of, I would describe it as irritation, because given the present political situation in the United States, they would prefer if we not deal with Chinese vendors. But our Prime Minister conducts things in this way. He first seeks the capital from the US. If it's not available, you've got to go to who's going to lend you the money.
Thank you. Question at the back.
Hi, my name is Joanna Burke. I'm the Chief Executive of Pacific Cooperation Foundation here in Auckland. We have, obviously, thank you for sharing with us the similar issues that are faced in the Caribbean that we have here in the Pacific. Aside from climate change, people and the movement of people and labour mobility throughout the region has become an issue in ensuring that we have people stay home to help develop their economies. Can you share with us, because I did hear that you don't have a First Nations, but you still have quite a large African population, what are the Bahamians doing to encourage that through innovation, to look at local solutions for some of the local problems that you are facing? Because it's great that you want to partner with other economies and countries that are facing similar things, but for us in the Pacific, we have to continue to look at home to see what our solutions are that are being born about by our own people. Is your country acknowledging that there is that sort of resource available at home, and what do you do to encourage that? It'd be interesting to find out. Thank you.
Thank you. The labor situation in the Bahamas is quite complex. So I'll start with the census. Last week, the census figures came out, and the rate of natural increase in the Bahamas is 1.2%, which means it's below replacement level. And the population grew mainly because of immigration. And I would say, without disaggregating it myself, I would think most of that is Haitian migration to the Bahamas, which forms the base of the workforce. So if you went to a construction site, you went to a gas station, went to a mechanic shop, you would find inevitably it's Haitian labor that's running all of these facilities. That is a point of increasing tension in the society. And we have to, as a political issue, manage it very skillfully. So it's almost a 50-50 divide. Some say get rid of them all, others say you have no choice but to integrate. So that's the political problem that we're managing. Now, we are part of something called CARICOM, and CARICOM has a treaty called the Single Market and Economy. It's called the CARICOM Single Market and Economy. And all of the countries signed an agreement back in 2006, which bound them to creating a single economic space. We could not get the support in the Bahamas to join it. So we had to enter a reservation. And while we are part of CARICOM, the only part that we participate in is the functional cooperation across things like foreign policy and emergency preparedness, health issues, the legal counsel, those sorts of things, the University of the West Indies, but not part of the single market and economy. Again, because as a political proposition, we just couldn't sell it to people. There was too much hostility to it. On the other hand, though, last year, the country collected $110 million in change in work permit fees. So if you look at it, you will see that there's no incentive to turning down work permits to come to the Bahamas because it's a money earner for the country. So again, the truth doesn't always sell, and there's all this hostility, but in fact, the economy would collapse if foreign labor were excluded. And this goes in things as diverse as education. I've already talked about the Cuban teachers, but we have 26 population centers, very remote islands, and it's difficult to get Bahamian teachers and doctors to agree to go to these islands. So very often these health facilities and schools are being manned by either Cuban doctors and nurses, and certainly Guyanese teachers. The education system would largely collapse if they didn't come to the Bahamas. So that's the labor picture there. And of course, what the census is revealing is that the population is getting older. So that has implications for national insurance. It has implications for health. We need to have a policy on seniors and how to deal with that coming down the road. But these are all not easy discussions to have in the country at the moment.
Thank you. Question here at the front. This gentleman there.
Thank you, Minister. I'm David Villa. I'm from Amnesty International. My question is, are there any recent steps from the current government to do awareness campaigns in the country or any formal steps for abolishing the death penalty? We welcome that since year 2000 have been executed. I'm wondering if there is any recent steps for formally abolishing the death penalty.
There are no formal steps to abolishing the death penalty, but most of us who are lawyers, and I'm an anti-capital punishment person myself, but most of us who are lawyers believe effectively the penalty's been abolished anyway as a result of the Privy Council decision on executions, which says that only the worst of the worst can be executed, and there must be no hope of rehabilitation of the person who's been convicted of the offense. Try jumping over those hurdles. You're quite lucky if you can do so. And so far, no Caribbean country has been able to overcome any of those two hurdles. So that's why there have been no executions since 2000. And the law has been changed to give a policy on sentencing in cases where people have been convicted of murder, capital murder. And that's been the practice. Again, as I was saying in the previous answer, as politicians, some of these things you just don't get involved in. It's better left unsaid and accept the status quo.
Thank you. Any more questions? Hamish?
You must have, as you say, we have an Asian population. Sorry, my name is Jane. I work in international development, mainly in the Pacific. Youth are a very important part of the future. What is the likelihood of high unemployment and inability to work within the nation? And we touched on labour mobility, the ability to go out to earn money to come back in.
So the United States, as you know, is a big draw for labor because one of the issues that you were getting at is this issue of the brain drain, which is a concern throughout the Caribbean. And I just remember we were at a meeting with Joe Biden when he was vice president down in Trinidad 2013. And the prime ministers there were all complaining about the fact that U.S. was simply attracting nurses, for example. So we have a shortage of Bahamian nurses right now because in the U.S. you get a signing bonus of $80,000 upon signing. They give you permanent residence for you and your family, and of course the salary is 3-4 times what you would get in the Bahamas. So nurses are leaving. The other issue is that youth unemployment is high, too high. And part of that has to do with skills and the inability or failure somehow to be able to provide the skills for a growing economy. You would think that construction jobs, for example, that's why foreign labor does most of the construction. You can't get Bahamians in numbers to do construction work or to do landscaping and that kind of stuff. Contractors complain. And one of the areas that's a major concern is the dysfunction in the young male population. So women far exceed the success of young men in the Bahamian population to the point where it's a public policy issue now. So I often use this statistic. You have about 2,500 men in jail between the ages of 18 and 25 or 35, and about 50 women. You go to the College of the Bahamas or the University of the Bahamas, I think they had something like 500 women graduate and maybe 50 men. So that's the issue we're facing. And it's great for women because they've educated themselves. There's a lot of mobility in the market for them. But as they often ask, who's your daughter going to marry? And the knock-on effects like violence against women and the fact that this is all these social problems which come with it. So that's what we're struggling with on that side.
Kia ora, I'm Hamish McDougall, the Executive Director of the New Zealand Institute of International Affairs. And I just want to ask two questions, if I may, about the campaign for reparations for slavery. It's a really interesting development to come out of the job and this commitment to dialogue. The first question is, where does that campaign go from here? And is the Commonwealth mainly going to be the vehicle to push for change, or other vehicles? And also, thinking of our region here in the Pacific, which also suffered a lot of harm through colonisation, albeit slightly different forms and timeframes to the Atlantic. But what do your peers in the Pacific, what views were they giving about the debate about slavery at Jobbin, and where does the Pacific kind of fit into that wider campaign?
So there was supposed to be a declaration on reparatory justice on slavery, or for slavery and for indigenous people, and that the Commonwealth could not agree on that declaration. The British pushed back very hard on it, and the language ended up with the declaration being dropped, and then paragraph 22 simply saying there would be a commitment to discussing the question of reparatory justice. So while I was here, Karim just kindly agreed for me to have a chat with a lawyer who's part of the indigenous population of this country to talk about what those issues actually mean in practical terms. And we were able to come to some agreements on some of the dysfunctions that have shown up in our populations in the Caribbean and similar things here. For example, I was telling her I've seen a movie on the flight coming over called In the Zone, where a Black American came here to this country and set up a hostel for boys to allow them to get into, is it Auckland College, boys grammar school? Right. And it's like 70 kids got placed in the school, and I gather here, it depends on what district you live in. And so because the school was there, there's a high demand to get places in that school. And they were able to successfully matriculate as a result of putting that hostel there. So we're trying various things like that to try and improve the dysfunctions in the country as well. So it's good to have that discussion. So the next step, to answer your first question, is there's an agreement. You know, the Commonwealth moves kind of creakingly, and we sing Kumbaya at the end of everything. So it was decided that there would be a discussion on this matter at the UK CARICOM Forum, which takes place in March in London. And that forum is going to commission a report. And the report will examine the question of reparations. And then there's supposed to be a summit with Caribbean prime ministers and the British Prime Minister to discuss what the report means. So, you know, that's typical Commonwealth procedure. And the hope is that the discussion gets going how this is actually going to be carried out. So we've used examples like Georgetown University or Cambridge University, who are all have conceded the point on slavery, its immorality, and ill effects on the populations, and they've offered things like scholarships to go to those universities for Caribbean students. That's one issue, one way you can deal with it. The British are afraid of the cost. One judge has said it's something like 18 trillion pounds, which is owed. So that obviously would frighten the bejesus out of anybody. But the discussion has to be had. The slaves, 700,000 slaves, were so-called freed in 1834. The slave owners were paid 20 million pounds in cash, and I think another 47 million pounds. And that approximates to about 3.5 billion in today's money. They just paid off the note in 2015. So some of the journalists were asking me, why should taxpayers today in Britain be paying for something that happened 200 years ago? But they were paying anyway, up to 2015, paying off a note that dates back to 1834. The British started off by saying that they would not offer compensation to prisoners who were tortured during the Mau Mau rebellion in Kenya, in the decolonization period in Kenya. And they ended up, in the end, paying. So, you know, these things start with, no, I'm not going to do it. And then you come to some agreement as to how to do it. I think they ended up paying £3,000 to each of the persons who suffered torture during the Mau Mau. Yeah, William Hague was the Foreign Secretary at the time, and you can read it online where he made the announcement to do so. So that's where I think it's headed, and we will. I've made a commitment here to try and organize a Zoom meeting between our folk in the Caribbean and folk here to discuss synergies and history and developments and how we can work together. And then hopefully people will come to the Bahamas or to Jamaica, wherever is convenient.
Okay, so we've got time for 2 more questions, if there are any.
My name's Peter Wilson. I'm a retired humanitarian worker, spent all my life in Asia. We're looking, it seems, in the future, instead of a unipolar world, a multipolar world, and we hear a lot of discussion about Russia and China, United States, BRICS, but we don't hear anything about the G77. Now this is a group, I think I'm right in saying, at 123. Mm-hmm. And they potentially could wield immense power because they could control the General Assembly. Could you give us your perspective on the G77? Could they potentially emerge as a polar grouping, or are they so diverse that it's unlikely they can ever have that sort of bulk?
If I were to guess, I mean, everyone goes to these meetings and there's an expression, I think the lawyers call it a precatory expression, which is that the wish is that we could all get together and act as a body and then cause things to change. The reality is somewhat different. The reality is post the Second World War, and forgive me if I'm telling you something that you already know, is that since Britain's collapse as the world's superpower, the United States has been the supervening power in the world. And between the United States and Western Europe, they created a construct which today I've described as the Pax Americana. And there always seems to be a supervening power that's responsible for enforcing, if you will, world order. We're watching very closely what is happening in the United States now, and I've referenced this a couple of times. There's an article in this month's Vanity Fair about a man named Steve Bannon, who was a Trump aide, who's now in jail for contempt of Congress. But he leads a group of people on the very far right in the US who are hoping that with the coming of Trump to office, that they can deconstruct all of the institutions and the philosophy of those institutions that were created in the Second World War. So that means the de-dollarization of the world economy, the pulling back of the military of the United States from across the globe, and retreating behind the walls of the US. And essentially their view is it's none of our business, and you just take care of yourself. Clearly, that is not something which we would find acceptable. We think that, or we've noticed that in things large and small, the United States largely drives public policy around the world. When they withdrew from COVID, when they withdrew from the World Health Organization and withdrew from the climate change agreements, the whole thing just foundered. I think the French tried to fill in the spaces, but just didn't have the heft to do it, and clearly Britain doesn't anymore. So if the United States does not exist, you're going to have to invent something that's like the United States to sort of enforce world order, if you will. For good or bad, there's a moral element to the US which we find acceptable, even though there are various faults with their systems and their conduct. And so the hope is that there's not this deconstruction going forward. As for the South-South cooperation, which is the other side of what you're arguing, there is a need for that because one of the excesses of the US system is the unfair advantage which they gain as a result of the dollarization of the world economy. And so the result is that countries who they just have disagreements with, they can unilaterally impose sanctions based on their own internal morality, which may have nothing to do with the countries themselves. And so Cuba being the one example in our region, the place is almost at the point of collapse. They're unable to trade around the world. They can't move money around the world. And this is unfair. It's punishing the people and not the government. We've tried to make that case to them time and again, but it's ignored by their local domestic politics. So those are the realities I've described, but what you see happening is an attempt by the South-South cooperation to create a bipolar world in that sense, so that some of these difficulties that arise with the present system can be eased going forward. It's proving to be problematic, and one of the issues that, of course, concerns me is the fact that those of us who are arguing that don't want to end up on the side of a country invading another country and then justifying it, saying that the way we can escape the sanctions is to create our own system on the side. When asked to make a choice between US and Ukraine, for us it's US and Ukraine, notwithstanding the other issues that I've raised. I hope that helps.
Cool. So time for one more question.
being Bahamas a low-lying country, is there any projects expected on mitigation and adaptation in the next few years? You see an example here nearby here, Tuvalu is investing in and have international support on mitigation and adaptation with land reclamation, but also looking at mobility with the Falapili agreement with Australia. Are there any projects similar for adaptation in Bahamas sector?
New Providence, the island that the capital sits on, Nassau, the experts have told us that if we do nothing to reverse the rising sea, in the year 2070, 30% of that island will be underwater. And in 2100, 70% of the island will be underwater. So that's the story all around the country. And there is a need for huge investments in seawalls and other infrastructure to support the fight against climate change. Our difficulty is a financial one in the sense that we have a GDP per capita of $35,000 per year per person. So this puts you in the category of rich countries or middle income countries. So that means the concessional financing to get the funding is not available, at least not from the Bretton Woods institutions. So we have to go to the market to borrow money at 9–10%, I think recently 13%. The Chinese offer 2 to 3% on infrastructural investments. An analysis of our national debt shows that 50% of the national debt is due to extreme weather over the last decade. So we've got sort of $12 billion US in national debt, so about $5.5 billion of that is due to weather. And every time something happens, you've got to go to the market. So one of the reasons we're trying to raise the profile of the country is so that people will understand the nature of the problem, which I call the Robinson Crusoe problem, where Robinson Crusoe and his man Friday are on an island, and Robinson Crusoe is worth $1 billion and Friday is worth $1. So the GDP per capita on that island is 500 million and 50, except Friday has nothing and Robinson Crusoe has plenty. And that's the distortion you have using GDP per capita. So we've been trying to get people off that and to start looking at the vulnerability index as a different measure. We have this bifurcated response where the State Departments or the foreign ministries think it's fantastic, they agree with it, but they can't get their treasuries to agree to do anything about it. So part of what I do as foreign minister is I go around to try and talk this up so that, again, talking is the first step in trying to bring about change. And there's a very old movie called The Lion in Winter, and one of the lines it says, when your voice is all you have, you use your voice. Thank you.
Minister, thank you for your address, and members, thank you for your questions. I'm really